3 in our study in the book of Ruth. Little review, as always, is in order. Last week, chapter 2, we saw Ruth going into the fields to glean, something only the very poorest of the poor are forced to do. And without any planning or scheming on her part, she just happens to end up in the field of Boaz, who is a relative of Naomi. Now, she doesn't know who he is. And as far as she's concerned, this is just perhaps coincidence, but it's not. This is God bringing her into the field of one of the people who can help her and can help Naomi. She works hard when she's there. She gains the notice of the reapers. Boaz comes along then, and when he discovers her identity, he shows her incredible kindness. Her devotion and her care for Naomi have been fully reported to him, apparently. Even this, though, even knowing what kind of woman she is, his care for her seems extravagant. He almost commands her, "Don't you leave my fields. Stay among my maids." He invites her to lunch. He brings her into the community. He personally serves her roasted grain. When he leaves, he takes the workers aside and he says, "Don't harass her, but make her job easy. Let her glean even among the sheaves and pull out some grain and leave it. Make her job easy." So that when she goes home, she has this incredible amount of barley that she has harvested. And as I noted last week, this indicates more than just compassion on the part of Boaz. Because if concern for the poor was all that was on his mind, there's far easier ways to show it. He's got a whole team of people working for him. He's got servants. He's the head of a household. And he can just send one and say, "Would you take a bushel of barley or a bushel of wheat to Naomi and Ruth? They're probably out from the last one." Very easy ways to take care of a couple of widows in their situation. But instead, Boaz so constructs his care for Ruth that it keeps her coming back to his field. Keeps her under his protection, under his care. There are indications, and I would argue strong indications, that Boaz has a romantic interest in Ruth. But he doesn't come back. We're kind of left hanging at the end of chapter 2. It starts out so promising. Here's this figure of Boaz, and he's extravagant in his care for Ruth, but he doesn't come back, which kind of sets the stage for the events of chapter 3. But from chapter 2, one of the main things I wanted you to see was the return of hope to Naomi's life. Chapter 1 was kind of hopeless for her, wasn't it? Famine, displaced to Moab, loses her husband, loses both sons. Now, the author doesn't think it's quite so hopeless because he brings the contrast in. There's a famine at the beginning, a harvest at the end. There's the leaving of Bethlehem at the beginning. There's the return at the end. There's her. I probably said this in a way not as respectful as it should have been to Elimelech and to Mahlon and Chilion. Ruth said, or Naomi says, "I went out full, but the Lord brought me back empty." I think the way to think of it is she went out full with a husband and 2 sons. She came back more full with Ruth, who is better for her than 7 sons, the author tells us. So chapter 1, though, ends with her just dejected and hopeless. Chapter 2 just begins to introduce all the reasons that she should be hopeful. God has not forgotten her. There's a man named Boaz, a kinsman. He exists. He's there on the scene. She's got a relative that might have some responsibility to help her. He's wealthy. He's godly. God's hand appears to be on this as he arranges a meeting. This man, Boaz, is compassionate towards Ruth and almost certainly has a romantic interest in her. Now, this part about the romance is not meant to be cute. I mentioned last week that probably as the workers were watching this, they might have smiled a little bit as they see this man just doting on this young widow, winking at one another a little bit. But I don't think it's meant to be cute, because if you're a couple of poor widows who need to glean in order to eat and need to sell your land in order to have some money, a wealthy, godly man who's interested in marriage is nothing to laugh about. This is survival. This is God's provision for them. Ruth had pledged to care for Naomi. and said, nothing but death is going to part us. And she's come to take refuge under the God of Israel. But God has means. He has ways. How is he going to do it? How is he going to meet the needs of these women? The chance that Boaz might be willing to redeem them socially through marriage and financially through buying the field is no small thing. And it's Naomi's realization that this might just happen, that transitions are from depression to exaltation in an instant. When Ruth comes back with all the grain, and she says, wow, where were you? And Ruth says, well, I was in the field of some guy named Boaz. Naomi just explodes in praise, and she says, may he be blessed of the Lord, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead. Chapter 2, verse 20. And so as Boaz comes on the scene and begins to act in a certain way, the minute Naomi finds out about it, her countenance changes. God has not forgotten her. There is hope. And the author wants us to see something here as well. When Boaz is introduced in chapter 2, verse 1, he's just a relative, a kinsman of Elimelech, probably related to Naomi only through marriage. But it's just a normal word for relative. It's not the word elsewhere translated in your scriptures as kinsman redeemer, as close relative. He's just a guy who's distantly related through marriage to Elimelech, or somewhat related. But in verse 20, when Naomi hears about the meeting and sees Boaz's generosity, she uses a different term for him. He is now the kinsman redeemer. It's gone from just having a relative who's generous to having someone who can actually fulfill some of the provisions of the law for a widow or for the very poor. There's so much to be hopeful about in chapter 2. It develops Boaz's character and it develops his role. He might just be the one these women need. But the chapter ends and nothing appears to be happening. We only read of Boaz going to the field one time. The barley harvest finishes, the wheat harvest finishes. I'm not a farmer. I don't know how long that takes when you just have a sickle and workers, but you're probably talking a few weeks. And Boaz never comes back, or at least we never read of him coming back. So there's this promise in chapter 2 that he might be the one, and nothing's happening at the end of the chapter. So what are Ruth and Naomi supposed to do? Chapter 3 will explain it and give it to us. If you don't have a Bible, we're going to read all of chapter 3. If you don't have a Bible and you'd like one, if you raise your hand, I think Sam has got some in the back. There's one. Anybody else? Okay, let's begin reading chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maid you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. It shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down, and then he will tell you what to do. She said to her, all that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. It happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward. And behold, a woman was lying at his feet. He said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. Then he said, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence. Now, it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. So she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Again he said, Give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did it go, my daughter?" And she told her all that the man had done for her. She said, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, 'Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then she said, "Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest until he has settled it today." I think maybe the first thing we need to do in the way of trying to understand this part of the story is to try to explain and understand the actions of Naomi and Ruth. If you read it wrongly, and you can very easily read it wrongly, chapter 3 could be seen as sinful, it could be seen as seductive, it could be seen as manipulative and utterly unbiblical. A couple of scheming women coming to a man who maybe had 1 glass of wine too many to try to get him to marry them and bail them out financially. Make no mistake, Naomi is looking to get Ruth married, but it's not that. I say she's looking to get her married because remember back in chapter 1, she tries to send her back to Moab and says, "May you find rest, each of you, in the house of your husband." Rest is going to come when they get remarried and have someone to provide for them. And here she begins a chapter by saying, "Shall I not seek rest for you?" So Naomi is definitely wanting to push this relationship forward. She's definitely wanting to see Boaz and Ruth joined in marriage, but it's not scheming or seductive or manipulative. That's not what this story is about. It's about 3 people working their way through a situation that does not have the nice, clear-cut rules that we might like to have. There's no one text you can point at and say, here's exactly how Ruth and Boaz ought to interact and how they ought to move forward. So what is it that led to this somewhat unusual plan, this midnight visit by Ruth? We're not told explicitly, but I think we can fill in some blanks. First, we've noted Naomi knows that Boaz has some interest in Ruth. You've got to be a bit blind not to see it in chapter 2. And it's why Naomi stresses, "Were you not among his maids?" She knows that he has brought her into the community, into his family already in a sense, and puts her among his other maids. She's not the outsider anymore. She's been brought in. Something Boaz has done for her. Naomi knows that Boaz has interest. Women notice these things. Guys are a little thick, but I promise you, Naomi looked at this and said, "I know what's going on. He's interested." The second thing, of course, we discover is that Naomi knows he's a kinsman. So he's not just a man who's interested, but he's a relative, and the law has something to say about relatives and their care for a widow and their care for those who are poor. So this is not a scheme that Naomi cooked up, saying, "Hey, there's a guy, he's got some money, let's go get him." Rather, God has promised in his law that there are ways that we can be redeemed from the situation that we're in. And Boaz might be just such a redeemer. And the third thing, Naomi knew also that Boaz had not returned to the field. So he's interested, he's eligible, and he hasn't come back. Those are 3 facts that she would have. We can read them in the story. She would have had them as well. And this is not like Boaz, because in verse 18, we find that he is a man who will not rest until he has settled it. He's a man of action. He's a man who doesn't put it off. If there's something to be done, he does it, but he's doing nothing, as chapter 2 ends. Now, what would you do if you had just those few facts to go on? He's a kinsman, he's got interest in Ruth, he's a man of action, and he's not taking any action. I think you'd ask why. What's going on? This isn't like Boaz. And there are answers to that question that I think we can infer, and I certainly think Naomi could infer as well. We already mentioned one last week. There's an age difference. She's a young woman, he's an older man. He calls her my daughter consistently. And as we saw in verse 10, he expected Ruth to be interested in a man her own age. He said, "You haven't gone after a younger man, whether poor or rich." It was kind of his expectation. And if that was his expectation, it was probably also Naomi's as well, that would be the cultural norm, that you would marry a little bit closer to someone your own age. And so I don't think it takes any imagination to see Naomi asking herself, I wonder if Boaz feels that Ruth would not be interested because he's older. Naomi knows there's other factors. Boaz is a kinsman, but he's not the brother of Elimelech or Mahlon. He's not a brother. He's not that close. And so there's no real obligation for him from Deuteronomy 25. He doesn't have to step into this role. But further, she knows he's not the closest kinsman. When she says at the end of chapter 2, oh, he's a kinsman, he is one of our closest kinsmen. In Leviticus 25 is rather explicit. It is the closest kinsman that is the redeemer of the land. So he's a relative, but he's not first in line. Those two facts, that he's not a brother, he's not a brother to one of the deceased, which kind of releases him from Deuteronomy 25, and that he's not first in line, don't just release Boaz from this. It means he doesn't have any rights in this matter. It'd be cutting in line, so to speak, for him to step forward and begin to insert himself into the role of kinsman redeemer. Now, the author doesn't put all that together for us. And at the beginning of chapter 3, we're kind of left to speculate, same as Naomi would have been. But by the time that we're done with the chapter, we find that those things are true. The age difference is in his mind. The fact that he's not first in line is in his mind. And so that's why he's just standing back. What do you do? There's no clear-cut instruction in the Word. And if we can put this together, so can Naomi. But it still doesn't explain why she cooked up this rather odd plan to send Ruth into the barn at midnight. I promise you, nobody reads Ruth. I hope none of you read Ruth and go, oh, I've got a plan for how to get my daughter married. I'm going to get her dressed up real pretty and send her to the barn at night and lay down at the foot of a man who's had one glass of wine too many, perhaps. And it will work out well. None of you think that way. So why does she do it? Well, in my reading of the Scriptures, it's not a mother's place to arrange a marriage for her daughter. It's the place of the father. But Ruth's father is nowhere to be found, probably back in Moab. Naomi's father is almost certainly dead, given Naomi's age. So where's the man who will make this request of Boaz, who will approach Boaz and say, have you thought about this? Is there some interest? Well, there is a close relative. But he's the very kinsman redeemer that is in line ahead of Boaz. And it would be just a bit awkward for Naomi to go to him and say, would you mind going and talking to your replacement? I know that the law says you're first in line, but we really like this guy better. How do you do that? How does Ruth say yes to a question that Boaz very much wants to ask, but is not asked for all the reasons that we've noted? Well, she goes to him privately, not publicly. She's not going to put him on the spot. I think the scene late at night in the barn has much more to do with privacy than anything else. If Boaz, for some reason, wants to say no, or there's some complications, it can be dealt with not in the public square. There will be no shame at the end of this either way. And since it's not her place to take the lead in the relationship and simply say, marry me, she finds a way to communicate her interest and her willingness non-verbally. It's why she gets cleaned up and dressed as well as she can. She's not there in her work clothes to discuss gleaning. She's there in her best to communicate this is a much more personal visit. Are you interested or not? And it's also important to notice how Ruth approaches Boaz. She lays down at his feet. Now, if her intentions were not honorable, she might have laid down by his side. But laying down at the feet is a much more submissive, much more humble posture. In Luke 7, I believe it is, it's the woman who wants to just say thank you to Jesus and express her love for Jesus for having forgiven her sins, that lays down at his feet and wets his feet with her tears. It's a position of submission, not of seduction. So the combination of when she comes to him at night, privately, how she comes to him in her best dress, and where she lays at his feet, I think it's all designed to say, the answer to the question that you really want to ask me is yes, without pushing him too hard or being manipulative or seductive. It's designed to help Boaz move forward in the relationship without taking away his responsibility to lead and to make a decision, something that Naomi seems to be very sensitive towards, because after she tells Ruth what to do, Get dressed up, go here, lay at his feet. He says, after that, Boaz will take the lead. He'll tell you what to do. Well, Boaz wakes up, and he realizes someone is there, and he's startled. And it's dark enough that he has to ask, who is it? And the answer is, I am Ruth, your maid. And now notice the transition from chapter 2 to chapter 3. In chapter 2, she goes, I'm not like one of your maids. I'm a foreigner. Why are you being nice to me? I don't belong. But his inclusion of her to be among his maids and his care for her and just her reputation out in the community, she is no longer Ruth the Moabitess. She is Ruth, the maid of Boaz. And she knows it. She accepts the gracious transformation that is in the story. But then she says something more, something Naomi had not commanded her to say. She says, so spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. Now, is that a demand? You got to marry me? Is Naomi's approach not direct enough, and so Ruth is just going to cut right to the heart of the matter? Well, it is an offer of herself in marriage. At least that's how Boaz seems to take it. He says in verse 11, I will do for you whatever you ask. He understands that she's asking something, and it's clear that she's asking about marriage. But there's something much more subtle and more significant here than just saying, marry me. What she's really saying is, I want you to be the means by which God cares for me. Do you remember back in 2:12 where Boaz said, may the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. Boaz knows Ruth has come from Moab to Bethlehem to seek refuge under the wings of God. The same word translated wing in 2:12 is the same word translated covering in 3:9. You could say, I am Ruth your maid, so spread your wing over me. Here's how I understand it. Boaz knows that Ruth is trusting in God to provide for her as well as for Naomi. She's left everything. She's followed Naomi. She's come to seek refuge under the Lord's wing. She doesn't need a husband. Naomi warned her, if you come to Bethlehem, there's no husbands for you. If you want to be married, you should go back to Moab. So I would assume Ruth knows, I don't have to get married. Life will be hard, but God will provide. And that's what she needs. She needs the Lord to be gracious to her. But as she looks at Boaz, his actions, as she looks at who he is and that he's related to Naomi, and as she looks at God's hand being over this, she says, you're the wing. You're the one. You're the means by which God, under whose refuge I have come to Bethlehem to seek, you're the one that will be that refuge. Ruth has a very theological take on her potential relationship. Boaz is the fulfillment of God's promise to take care of those who seek shelter under his wings. Now, Boaz knows what she's asking, and he seems more than a little impressed. You can see it in his response in verse 10. May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, there's our confirmation that Boaz himself is aware of and concerned about the age difference. He expects her to go after a younger man, someone her own age. He did not expect her to have interest and maybe not even willingness to consider a union between the two of them. But how is it that the last kindness of being willing to marry him is greater than the first kindness? You see that your last kindness is greater than your first. Her first kindness, I believe, is her commitment to care for Naomi. Her second kindness then in context would be her willingness to marry someone her father's age, which means then she's going to have two older people to care for. Some of you know what it's like to care for an older person, someone whose health is not as good as it once was. It can be a huge responsibility. I had a conversation with someone just this morning regarding that. So Ruth has come and says, I will care for Naomi. And now she said, I will marry Boaz. And in context, I would argue it means she's going to end up caring for him too. He is her father's age, a full generation older. So Boaz understands Ruth is not chasing his money. He's not demanding that he marry her. She is showing kindness to both Naomi as well as to Boaz, with the latter being greater than the former. That's my best shot at explaining what's going on here. And why Ruth and Naomi are not guilty of manipulation or seduction. They know why Boaz is holding back. He's older. He's not first in line. And they find a way to communicate, we don't want you to hold back. We want you to move forward with this relationship. And now comes, I think, one of the most incredible parts of this chapter. If you get this, I think it will change your life. As far as we know, Boaz has never been married. Given the fact that both Ruth and Naomi are presented as widows, if Boaz was a widower, I suspect that we would be told that as well. No children are mentioned, and so I think the story leads us to believe that Boaz had been single all his life. But now this godly older man who's never married suddenly has this incredible young woman thrust into his life, and he's smitten. She is worthy. They are well matched. The same word that describes him in 2:1, that he is a man of standing or a man of great wealth, a man of excellence, kind of a broad term, we talked about that, describes her in 3:11. She is a woman of excellence. The author is telling us this is a well-matched pair. They belong together. Who and what she is has been fully reported, even to those who do not know her. There are not many men like, or many women, excuse me, bad slip for this day and age, isn't it? There are not many women like Ruth then or now. She's an incredible woman. Boaz loves her, and she's just made it clear she wants to marry him. So it's time to get married, right? He loves her. We're not sure that she loves him, but she's willing to marry him. She takes pretty extraordinary steps to say, I want to be your wife. And God appears to be all over this meeting. How can it not be his will? Go forward and get married. And here's where Boaz does something that far too Christians are willing to do. I don't know that I would be willing to do it. And so I'm not judging others, and I wouldn't want you to do it either. But I want you to notice something incredible that Boaz does. He submits his dreams of marrying Ruth to the whole counsel of God. Whole counsel being the operative term. Here's what I mean. If you consider things in isolation, Boaz is just free to marry Ruth. Deuteronomy 25 says it should be a brother of the deceased. There is no brother of the deceased. There's nobody in line ahead of him to marry Ruth. He's free to do that. But if you consider not just Deuteronomy 25, but Leviticus 25, well, then there is somebody in line ahead of him, because Leviticus 25 is specific. It will be the closest relative that redeems the land. So now you got a bit of a conflict maybe, but they're different texts, right? One talks about a widow and raising up a son. The other talks about buying land to give some financial support to a widow. So why not let Boaz marry Ruth and let the closer kinsman who's first in line redeem the land of Naomi? And here's what I think is going on. Boaz knows that for Ruth to keep her vow to Naomi, they can't be in two separate households. They belong in the same household. The kinsman that redeems Naomi's land, would Naomi become part of that household, part of that family? Boaz marries Ruth, and now the two that have vowed to be together are now separated. For whatever the reason, and I don't pretend to be an authority how their culture would have worked in these particular ways, Boaz sees these two things as joined. He says in chapter 4, verse 5, on the day, he's speaking to the nearest kinsman and redeemer, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also acquire Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. Now, the law made no such demand that you link those two texts, but Boaz saw it. He says, I think this is the right way to proceed. It's not just the letter, it's the spirit of the law. There's a vow involved. These two things have become linked. Now, that's the reasoning of a man who wants to know all that God's word might say about a particular situation. Not just the texts that tell him what he wants to hear, but also the texts that tell him very much what he does not want to hear. He does not want someone to be in line ahead of him. Having thought through all that the word says, he now says to this woman who has come to him and said, I'm willing to marry you. He says, not yet, and maybe never. That's what verses 12 and 13 mean. And now it is true I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good. Let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you, as the Lord lives. Lie down until morning. If he will redeem you, let him redeem you. You know what that means? If he wants to marry you, he's first in line. How much enthusiasm do you think Boaz had when he said that? If you've ever been in love and then had to wonder, is this God's will? You know this is hard. This is really hard for Boaz. He loves this woman, but to be fully righteous, fully submitted, he's got to consider the whole counsel of God. And in doing so, he will risk losing her. So I just see this incredible display of righteousness and faith and submission to God's word. And I know not only want to commend it to you, I mean, I've said before, these are not character studies in the book of Ruth, but there is something there to see. They're just glorious and wonderful. Would more of us be like Boaz, fully submitted to all that the word says and not just those things that support the position we want? So I want to see him in that way, but I also want you to note that I think we should see that this is another way that Boaz foreshadows Christ, who is the true kinsman redeemer. We haven't talked about that term all that much. The kinsman redeemer, part of it is kind of self-explanatory. It's a relative who redeems. A kinsman who redeems from barrenness, the obligation to raise up a son if there's a widow and the husband died, leaving no son, or who redeems from poverty, from destitution, to keep the land in the family. It's probably the most prominent theme in this book. It occurs over 20 times from that last occurrence in chapter 2 on through 3 and 4. I think there's 21 or 22 usages of it. It's just a prominent theme: redemption, redemption, redemption through the kinsman. And it's a word that gets used a few other places in the Old Testament associated with God. Texts that you know and love. Job 19:25. As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives. You all know that text, right? Same exact word used to describe Boaz. Psalm 19:14. O Lord, my rock and my Redeemer. Same word. Isaiah 41:14. Your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel. Same word. Jeremiah 50. Their Redeemer is strong. All that's talking about God. And it's the same word used to describe Boaz. Boaz, very intentionally, very explicitly on the part of God, is foreshadowing the true kinsman and redeemer, Jesus Christ. There's a Sunday school going on right now, or earlier hour, in the book of Hebrews. And we ended up kind of, because of time and all that, we ended up skipping over this particular verse. But Jesus is the kinsman redeemer in Hebrews, even when the words don't show up. Hebrews 2:14. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had the power of death, that is the devil, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Christ became one of us. He became our kinsman that he might become our redeemer. And Boaz is simply one of the clearer and more intentional foreshadowings of this reality, that Christ would be the kinsman redeemer that we ultimately need. And I don't think it's wrong to look at the explicit and extravagant righteousness that he displays in being fully submitted to the law of God and say, that's part of the shadow. That's part of who he is. God wills that this man exist and that he foreshadow the coming son in a number of ways. Now, going through Ruth like this, a chapter at a time, it really should be read all at once. But there's just way too much there. The main point doesn't come till chapter 4. We're just doing background. We're establishing what's going on, the situation, how they came to be widows, how their situation developed. We're seeing Boaz enter the picture and all the promise of that. Now we're seeing some development of that promise, that this might turn out really well, although, of course, there's this storm cloud because he is not the closest relative, and he will not cut in line. He will do all things according to the law. But at each chapter, even though we haven't come to the main point yet, I've tried to point something out that helps me. And in fact, some of it I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say that it just stuns me, some of the things I'm seeing in the book of Ruth. In chapter 1, it was the mere fact that Ruth came to faith. She sees all that's happened to Naomi. This is what happens to the people that worship Yahweh? Famines, displacement, losing your husband, losing both sons. What in the world made her say, I want your God? And Naomi tries to say, you really don't. You should go back to Moab. Now, I don't know what we're going to learn in the EE class, but I'm pretty sure we're not going to learn that if somebody comes to you and says, I want your God, I want to become among God's people, that we're not supposed to say, no, you should go back to your idols. But that's what Naomi says. Follow your sister who went back to her people and her idols. And Ruth says, no, I'm coming to Bethlehem to worship the Lord. That's amazing to me. God is sovereign. And against all odds, against even the pressure of Naomi to say, don't make this decision, she says, no, I'm making this decision. I'm following God. In chapter 2, I noted the fact that we are reminded again and again that Ruth is a Moabitess. 3 times she's Ruth the Moabitess in chapter 2, as though we'd forgotten from chapter 1 that she is indeed from Moab and a Moabitess. We're told again and again and again that the author is relentless in pressing that upon us. And I argued that the reason for that is that the author wants us to remember that the grace that's just being unpacked in this book, which is lavish and beautiful, is coming to somebody who is under the curse of the law. The law said that Israel was never to seek the welfare of a Moabitess, and yet grace upon grace is being shown to her. All the hope that is dawning in chapter 2 and in chapter 3 is dawning on a woman who has no right to expect any of it. In the end, I don't think it would be a stretch to say we're supposed to see that grace has the last word in Ruth's life and not the curse of the law. And there's something in chapter 3 now that grabs my attention as well, and with this we'll close. We're beginning to see how Boaz foreshadows Christ in his title of kinsman redeemer, in the actual work of redemption, and even in this evident righteousness and complete submission to the law. To say that Boaz is an impressive figure in this chapter is an understatement. He is without flaw in this chapter. And now, what I want you to see that I've been wanting to say for a long time, because this just blows me away. Do you know who he is? Some of you do. He's Rahab's son. He was raised by a harlot, a repentant harlot, but he was raised by a harlot. The hero is raised by a harlot. The one that God chose to say, I want to foreshadow the person and the work of my son, Jesus Christ, grew up in the home of Rahab. Let that sink in. That was God's choice. As he's telling the story of redemption, all the people he could have chosen, he chooses Rahab's son. Now, we're not told that in the story. We're told that in Matthew 1, in the genealogy, where it's explicit that as it goes, how do you get from Adam to Christ? It passes through Boaz, who was born to Solomon through Rahab. Now, a part of me wants to just kind of put this forth as a strong word of encouragement for those of us who have at one time or another just made an absolute mess of our lives. There's such a beautiful picture of redemption here, that God takes someone who had messed up her life just about as bad as you can and called her to repentance, provided a husband for her from the royal line of Judah, and wills that she give birth to Boaz and raise up this incredible, extraordinary man who foreshadows Christ. And I would just want you to see that whatever addictions, whatever behaviors, whatever decisions, whatever really stupid things you did that you're ashamed of, God seems more than willing not only to cleanse, but to make people like that useful and use them for glorious purposes. Do you ever worry, will my kids be as messed up as I was? Maybe. But I look at this picture of redemption. I look at what he's done. I look at who he chose to do it, and I just say, I think we have to have hope. Incredible hope. The harlot of Jericho raised the hero of our story. And there's something even better. Use it to give you hope. But there's something even better and more compelling than God taking this pagan, idol-worshiping harlot and calling her to faith. And I think it's the picture of God's delight in absolutely cleansing us from sin, totally apart from whether or not Boaz has this role or that role. You get the picture that he looks and creates the most unlikely, the most fallen person he can, and then say, when I call you to faith, you will not believe what I'm going to do. It's an incredible picture of redemption. And I can't think of a better preparation for the table. Think with me. The harlot raised the hero. Rahab raises Boaz, our type of Christ. That's the redemption that's purchased for us. Let's pray. Father, your story is amazing, and it is your story. This is you revealing yourself and your ways to us. You don't choose the pure to tell a story of redemption. You choose the impure and the corrupt, and then you redeem them, and you purify them, and you do things through them that leaves us breathless. And I pray that we would be breathless before this. It is an amazing thing to me that this man who is emerging in this story as the hero, as the Redeemer, as the foreshadowing of Christ, came to us the way he did, the son of a pagan, idol-worshiping harlot who repented. What a picture of redemption. What a picture of grace. I pray it would occupy our minds, not just in these next minutes. I pray it would occupy our minds for the rest of our lives. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.